let's go back to if you see something, say something. Arthur Shapiro was murdered and directly associated with the Iran-Contra affair. You don't realize, like, oh my gosh, Columbus, Ohio had quite a bit of stuff going on here. I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, he got to bring Southern Air Transport to Rickenbacker, and that's the CIA's torture airline. Like, right from Miami, let's just bring it right into Columbus. That allowed, like, ongoing shipments to multiple countries. Heck, there were easements created from Les Wexner's house, and I figured it was a pipeline because I knew, part of this plot, it is to take over U.S. agriculture for multiple reasons. One being that this is land that has never been sourced for oil, gas, and coal, and highly abundant with it in Ohio. If you look at where the majority of the coal and gas and oil is, they kind of targeted states associated with those opportunities. But back to, if you see something, say something. Arthur Shapiro's case and the entire investigation was implicating very important people in our government for being associated with planning a takeover of the United States and potentially a future attack on U.S. soil. So what does Ohio do? What did they do? They shot Arthur Shapiro, and then they destroyed all evidence. And some of that evidence overlapped with, of course, the securities being liquidated from the 1960s of George H. Dunlap. And then they always associated it, I guess, with the JFK assassination so that it would be sealed as part of this plot, to kill the president. But as somebody who didn't know anything about, the JFK assassination, I know more than anybody else now. And I know a lot about who killed. I mean, honestly, when I got to meet Mr. Slaughter, and he said, how are you going to solve the biggest, mysteries in U.S. history if you know nothing about U.S. history? And I said, I already know who was responsible at 68% out of the JFK investigation. And that would be the Royals and Shell. But it's Hess. It was Halliburton Energy Systems. It was Hess that they were using in the 1940s when Prescott Bush's bank got seized by the U.S. government for liquidating assets to Hitler. Germany. It's the same exact network. And it's just fascinating that if you would have seen something and said something, you became a target if you were on U.S. soil. Well, it's important that everyone understand that this plot, here's the fake U.S. Agriculture magazine from 1962, and here is the fake farmer's ad. By the way, make sure you pay attention in this ad. They bring it back in 2001, but there's no registered trademark. Farm Bureau. This is Farm Bureau Insurance, and it's a fake insurance entity that was created by the Rockefeller Rothschild enterprise, the industrial complex, if you will, and an adequate income for your loved ones for life, the assurance of college for your children, financial protection against accidents, retirement income, foretell the future with Farm Bureau Insurance. This isn't Farm Bureau Insurance. It's not the Farm Bureau Insurance Company that had been created for the sole purpose of protecting farmers. In fact, if you go in here, Big John and Little John, don't forget about that. Big John and Little John, Little St. John and Big St. John, and don't forget we'll come to St. George. But what? Supply management of land, food, and people. Wait, you're going to manage the supply of people? Yeah, that's what they're doing. That was the big goal. It's been the goal of this plot, which is a brilliant one. What better way to kill off Americans covertly while blaming us, causing us to just fight each other? But listen. The goal is described as the ABCD approach. The idea is to control farmers and manage their businesses and make farmers desperate. Because who doesn't like the feeling of desperation? So the goal of this entire program in the USDA as of 1962, when JFK had originally signed on for the plot, was the failure of the feed grain program that would cost the government more than $1 billion So the goal is the failure of the program, right? Failure, like the goal is to have this program fail and have our grain sources manipulated. Okay, all right, sounds great. And then basically, it's 30 years of experience in all kinds of liquidating farms. The goal ultimately of this entire program was to have several hundred thousand farmers fail. So I look into this. I'm like, it's not good. It's not good for Ohio. Only 45% of farmers as of 1961 will be eligible by the end of 1962. Boom. But anyways, the plot was shut down, and you should see this as Charles Schuman. When I saw that Big Papi Bush had appointed Charles Schuman a part of this farm credit program that was the same farm credit program from the 60s, his name was Charles Schuman. And I'm like, how is that possible? Charles Schuman wouldn't be alive. And Charles Schuman was banned from U.S. agriculture. This Charles Schuman, banned from U.S. agriculture as of 1968. It is Gerald Ford who reappoints him, gets his job back, just like Alan Dulles and these people come back, even though they shouldn't have ever been allowed back in U.S. politics. But it's Ford, Leslie King, who appoints Charles Schuman's son. So Charles Schuman becomes the head of the railroads because he's banned from U.S. agriculture. And then it's his son who Big Papi is like, oh, there's a loophole. They forgot to write in the contract that none of his heirs or spawns. But it's just easier if you can stick with the name. If you were liquidating U.S. agriculture and the Ohio Farm Bureau through Charles Schuman of the American Farm Bureau, which is owned by Standard Oil, and who was collaborating directly with Alan Dulles to do so, it's just easier to keep the same name. Bush, Schuman, Dulles. That's why they dropped the Washington and Dulles Airport. What? But back in the 20s and the 40s or in the 60s, there were families called the Mills and the Wells, and they were kind of fake. They were just fake people. They were spies. So that's another thing that we don't ever really hear about. It's like, what were those Cold War spies doing in the 1960s? Well, the Mills and the Wells were assuming the identities of basically Farm Bureau owners, cooperative owners, and then the Wells were basically just separating the mineral rights. Get it? The Mills is the land, and then they separate the mineral rights. 100% has always been aggregated and consolidated by J.P. Morgan Chase and the Chemical Bank. For who? Not Americans. British Oil. And Halliburton. Who also got no big contracts immediately. Halliburton triple dipped. Hess. It's the same as the 1960s at 68%. Yep. And so why does it matter? Well, JFK might have signed on for the plot and then he backed out. So I don't know what the law is technically with the CIA. Able to legally shoot him on U.S. soil? Maybe. Probably because it's Gerald Ford and Nelson Rockefeller making those laws. But still, let's just say that somebody signed on and JFK signed on. Nobody signed on for 9/11. And no one in America or the rest of the world signed on to have our land and our resources continually sourced in the most dangerous, illegal ways that are not safe. They're not safe. Ohio, for instance, they call it the Halliburton loophole. Dick Cheney had to create a separate EPA that operates separate from the federal government for Ohio. We have no Clean Water Act. And that is why this is so important. It's not just about 9/11. It's about that this is a plot that is still